Hello everyone, it's Old Guardian here. In this video I'm going to take a look at every single mini in Warcraft Rumble, all of their talents, and tell you which talents are the best. This video is recorded after Arthas was added to the game, after vultures were buffed. There have already been quite a few changes during 2025, and let's look at their effect on which talents are the best ones. And choosing the right talents is super important in Warcraft Rumble. You get your first talent when your mini reaches uncommon, and you cannot switch the talent until you reach rare. So by reaching rare you unlock a second talent slot, by reaching epic you unlock a third talent slot. The talents are offered to you on the grid, and you buy them from the grid. And they're offered to you randomly, but you will eventually get the talents that you want. Just be patient and don't necessarily buy the first one you get offered from the grid. In general, you're looking for something completely new abilities for your minis, additional damage, especially poison talents are pretty good, ways to control the game with stuns or freezes, cost reduction, survivability. There's plenty that talents have to offer. In 2025, Blizzard has been more active in also reworking talents than they have been before. So previously many minis used to have just one good talent, sometimes they had two good talents, but now we have more and more cases where minis actually have three viable talents, which makes your decisions even harder. On the other hand, then you also can't fail as hard because talents have more uses, but you need to be more careful on, okay, which one can I really leave as the last talent. So let's take a look at all the minis. You can use chapters down below to find your mini from this video. So if you have a specific mini in mind, just skip over there and you can see the talents for that mini. And for each mini, I will have the talents listed on the left side in order of preference. And then I will also have a bit of an explanation on why this is my preference. Let's get started with Jaina Proudmoore. Clear casting is the best option. It's used to create tempo spikes with spells, especially Execute or Eclipse into Execute, just getting constant cost reductions all the time so that you have more gold to spend on your spells. Second best is Flurry. Flurry was also buffed recently, and Flurry now applies both the slow effect as an AoE and deals AoE damage. So if you're not running a very heavy spell build, then Flurry actually has some potential uses nowadays. Whereas Blink can be unpredictable and even detrimental, so it's clearly worse than the other two. Jaina just goes away and doesn't do much. Maiev Remorseless is generally the strongest option. Double damage is pretty good thing to have. Then there's Enveloping Shadows, can be used to avoid putting Smoke Bomb into your deck, although nowadays with Smoke Bomb having some really strong talents like Ambush, then you typically run Smoke Bomb from those talents anyway, so it doesn't, Enveloping Shadows doesn't do quite as much nowadays. The Shadow Step can help Maiev close the distance, but typically you put Maiev right where you want her, and then she deals a bunch of damage already there anyway, so Shadow Step just most of the time doesn't do anything. Tirion Fordring has one talent that's vastly superior to the others, and that's Divine Shield. Gain a magical shield at 30% health, absorbing all damage for 5 seconds, and these complete immunity talents, they are just super strong in the game. So that's the talent that you really want. Vitalight can be strong if you use Tirion in a second line role, so Tirion is healing someone ahead of him, but it just can't hold a candle to Divine Shield. And then there's Consecrate, good against squads, but generally the weakest of the three. Arthas Menethil was recently introduced and already nerfed once. The duration of Purgatory was nerfed, the Footman Spawn was nerfed, so currently Death Grip looks like it's the best talent for Arthas. Great talent for answering various ranged minis, for example, so you have Huntresses or you have Pyromancers, you have anything. Ranged minis would usually be outside of the Frost aura of Arthas, the radius is only 6.5, but Death Grip just pulls them in and then you can handle them, so wonderful talent. Purgatory makes Arthas harder to kill, but now that the duration was nerfed to 3 seconds, it used to be 5 seconds, then Death Grip is generally the stronger talent, although Purgatory is the second best still. Then there's Necrotic Plague, which has some niche applications to poison minis, but you cannot soul shatter bosses, so you can only soul shatter regular minis anyway, which means that it remains the weakest talent. Malfurion Stormrage has two pretty good talents and one completely useless one. So first there's Germinate, protects your base, can also protect towers. It's generally the best talent. It's been nerfed a couple of times, but it's still very good. Then there's Deep Slumber, which allows you to do something that you can't do otherwise, because you can just put Malf somewhere in a corner, and Malf is going to stay there and keep healing everybody and doesn't affect the game otherwise. But you do lose the Seeds of Protection, and healing also doesn't stack, so you can't just play multiple Malfurions in a corner, it doesn't help you any. So there are some weaknesses to it, but it still allows something unique. Whereas Natural Salve provides only very minor healing, and that's why it's bad, because even if you have poison, you just don't heal enough. For Cairne, Reincarnation is generally the most useful talent, because it just gives Cairne so much more health. Cairne dies, Cairne comes back to life and keeps smashing. Planes running can be useful depending on the minis you use Cairne with, and it actually buffs Cairne's movement speed by plus 150% and not 50%, from 2 to 5, so Cairne just zooms away. On the other hand, other minis can't keep up, so that planes running Cairne is not always just a good thing. And then there's Aftershock, which doesn't seem to be very useful. All of Sneed's talents have some uses. I generally prefer Lead with Greed, truly shines in co-op content, so bringing all that gold, although I do like Land Grab as well. Now that Land Grab was buffed to give 2 levels every time it applies. However, it is capped at plus 10 levels, and it currently requires last hit on towers, which means that it doesn't always activate even if you have siege minis attacking towers, so that can make it a little bit awkward, but it can also make a pretty big Sneed, and that can be quite strong. Then there's Mine is Money Friend, and it makes Sneed a special kind of miner, because Sneed is going to mine the entire gold vein in a single swoop. So Sneed becomes a super miner. As a downside, sometimes Sneed just decides to, hey, I'm going to ignore all combat and I'm just going to go mine instead, which can be a bit of a problem. Grommash has 2 pretty decent talents and 1 really bad one. Typically the strongest one is Mirror Image. This spawns these 2 mirror images when Grom enters battle, and then these mirror images also taunt. So they deal damage and they take some hits instead of Grom, so that's pretty sweet. Although Savage Strikes can also be really powerful, deal double damage to enemies who are below 50% health, because you can really see how much damage Grom deals with that one. Then again, Blade Storm is really lackluster, it doesn't do much at all. Orgrim Doomhammer's best talent is Conqueror's Diplomacy. It's still something, even though it's just temporary, but still something, it can be powerful, it fights for you, that's just wonderful. Then there's Rally the Clan, adds a power spike to your army with the Bloodlust, and finally the Deathless Rage. It helps you to win Mak'gora, but because Mak'gora is not really a 1 versus 1 fight, you can just pour your entire army into that Mak'gora, then it's just not that useful. You're going to win Mak'gora most of the time anyway. Rend has 2 good talents and 1 useless one. First there's Scale and Steel. This resistant armored just makes Rend so much more survivable. It's really good. And then there's Flaming Soul. And if there are fights where there are squads, there are lots of swarms, then Flaming Soul can be the best one in those. Because then they're going to come in and they're going to dismount Rend, and then Living Bomb is just going to kill them. So it can be amazing in the right fight, but it's not as universally applicable as Scale and Steel. Whereas Legionnaire is largely useless. General Drakkisath really has 1 talent that you want, and that one is Chromatic Scales, grants nearby allies the resistant trait. This is the best way to give resistant to a large number of your minis, and it's immensely good. The others are not really that great. I mean, Piercing Blows attacks pierce through enemies in a line. Yeah, that's a very narrow line, by the way. You have to line them up very exactly, and then you can hit them with Piercing Blows. So, sure, sometimes it can work, but in general, it's not very strong. And Lasting Legacy also just doesn't do very much. Ragnaros the Firelord has 2 good talents and 1 mediocre one. First there's Radiant Flames, and buildings you control periodic damage nearby enemies, and this happens whether you play Ragnaros or not, so you're always going to get some value from those buildings. If there's lots of squads, for example, then that can be really good. However, Concussive Blast is quite strong nowadays, because the Concussive Blast was buffed, Blast Wave was buffed, so it's worth using nowadays, the spell, so that makes Concussive Blast pretty good. Then Sons of Flame, they have been a little bit left behind by this, because, okay, you get a couple of Fire Elementals, but they don't last very long, and then they're just gone, and then it's spent. So it's just not as useful as the other 2. Emperor Thaurissan has 1 great talent, 1 okay talent, and 1 bad talent. Hubris, the strongest, those bonus levels make minis so much stronger, it's just a phenomenal talent. Incinerate is the second best. Because Incinerate Lava Spike's burn is permanent, but it's not actually permanent, because it's not going to be permanent on bosses. On bosses it's just double duration 16 seconds, which makes it a little bit weaker, but it still has some upsides, but it just can't hold a candle to Hubris. And then there's Moira's Wit. It was already buffed to heal a little bit more, but it still does not heal nearly enough, so it's just not good enough. Baron Rivendare has 1 talent that's pretty much always good and 2 situational ones, because Chill of the Grave summons skeletal mages instead of warriors. However, the spawn time of those mages is significantly longer than the warriors, so you won't get nearly as many mages. But skeletal mages are really good, because they apply frost and they can also shoot air, so that's still the top talent. Deathpack can sometimes be useful. Periodic sacrifice a nearby skeleton to be healed, and it heals Rivendare to full. So this can sometimes be used to make Rivendare a lot tankier. And then the Skeletal Frenzy, nearby allied skeletons gain Bloodlust. Very build-around talent with very niche uses. Bloodmage Thalnos recently received a minor rework, but Bane remains the best talent. It's a big damage increase, it's just so good. However, the new talent Drain Soul is the second best. It stacks and the cooldown is per Thalnos. So if you had multiple Thalnoses on the board or if you save a big spell for a while, you can get some really big discounts going. Whereas Dominance is clunky and it's hard to play that many expensive spells. Sylvanas Windrunner has 2 great talents and 1 situational one, and Forsaken Fury is the talent that's the best in the endgame. It's completely passive, you don't have to play your Sylvanas, it only buffs your own minis in co-op though, but buffing Gargoyle, Meat Wagon, Plague Farmer, getting them all to shoot faster, that's just so wonderful. Very early in the game though, early in the campaign for example, Queen's Reach can be stronger than Forsaken Fury, because it makes Sylvanas outrage most bosses and all towers except for the Rocket Tower, so Sylvanas can just carry you through the normal campaign with Queen's Reach. Whereas Banshee's Wail is much weaker, it can help your Banshee survive. It's a range 8 stun, so it stuns most ranged minis, but it just doesn't have the pure power of Forsaken Fury or Queen's Reach. For Anub'arak, one talent is really far ahead of the others, and that's Explosive Shells. Scarab Beetles explode on death, dealing damage to nearby enemies. It's just a phenomenal talent. Trapdoor has been buffed a couple of times, and it's sort of becoming better, but it still can't compete with Explosive Shells. Trapdoor only procs once per Anub'arak, you can't heal above 50% and get it again, but it also does apply a short radius 5-second stun. And it temporarily ignores the beetle limit, so it's always going to spawn those beetles. So it has some upsides, but just not enough to compete. And then there's Regenerate. It can heal a lot, but it requires that Anub'arak survives some encounters and then burrows again, so they will get the heal. And that's just hard to set up. Cenarius has 2 really sweet talents and then 1 situational one. First of all, there's Force of Nature, summons treants from Cenarius' roots, but also from Dryad roots and other roots. Only ground minis, only when Cenarius is alive, but you're going to get a lot of treants from this one, and sometimes you just build a huge treant wall with it, and it's just beautiful. On the other hand, Revitalize can also be useful. It procs additional heals from any allied minis, so every chicken, every new vulture, and there's a lot of vultures nowadays, so it has the potential to deliver a lot of healing. And then there's Wild Growth. This is a global root effect. Only ground minis can be rooted. So situationally, getting Cenarius out there, getting global root can be strong, but the other 2 talents are just better. After multiple rounds of buffs, Onu actually has 3 good talents now. So from the trees, I still like From the Trees. It's a lot more damage. It doesn't work with Sappers, but damage is just really good. Play Onu, get stuff out there, and boom, enemies just die. However, I do like the new Barkskin a lot, because Barkskin now adds armor to Onu itself. Armor to those minis doesn't do a whole lot, but permanent armor to Onu, and Onu has more than 4000 health, and that's armored, so if it's a map where there's physical damage, Onu is just an incredible tank, so that can be a huge benefit. And then there's Petrify. It can keep your Onu push going because Onu dies, but you can just redeploy another Onu. So it still has its upsides, but it has now been overtaken by Barkskin. I like all of the Ysera talents. For solo play, I would pick Recurring Dream first. At second, changing Ysera mini to your deck cycles in the opposite direction, so you're going to be able to play a lot more Ysera minis, and Ysera minis are really strong, so if you have a deck that's a very low-cost cycle deck, you can just get a lot of value out of that. However, Recurring Dream is bugged in co-op. It's 50-50 chance which player gets the Ysera minis into their deck, so you generally don't want to equip that for co-op, you might just ruin your partner's day. Then there's Corrupted Dream, makes Whelps apply 2 stacks of poison, Drake applies 6 stacks of poison. That's just a lot of poison, and I do like that a lot, especially now that Whelps are unbound, so they can poison a lot of things. I also do enjoy Shared Dream, can help stall the game, like it did in Arthas Mythics for example. It does lose power quite rapidly if you're under-leveled, but it still has its upsides, but it's clearly the most niche out of the 3. Because Recurring Dream for most solo play, Corrupted Dream typically for co-op, and Shared Dream for some specific scenarios. Charlga is one of my favorite leaders. Cavernous Mists is still the best talent, because cost reduction, that's just incredibly strong always, at all times. However, Nature's Grasp after all the buffs is getting close. It can hit 3 targets, it deals full damage to all of those targets, it roots them if they're ground targets, so it's pretty powerful too. Spirit Passage has kind of fallen behind. Can be used to give something like Gargoyle Stealth, for example, in some situations, and you can get some really powerful pushes with that, but it's just fallen behind a little. Hogger is really interesting after all the buffs, because Hogger now has 3 good talents. Hamhog is generally the strongest. Hogger does a lot of damage, increased survivability helps it a lot. It caps at 3 stacks, but it's still pretty strong. And then there's the newcomer, the Fatal Frenzy. On death, Bloodlust can grant 1 level to allied beasts, and that's map wide. So you can buff your minis all over the map. If you cycle some Hoggers, you can buff them multiple times. It's just really, really sweet. And then there's still good old Spoiled Meat. Hogger deals even more damage. This is especially good if you do dungeons and you get the Lifesteal Relic, and then Hogger just smacks at stuff really quickly and gets poison damage on them and heals up a lot, so that's really sweet. But I think Fatal Frenzy is now better in general than Spoiled Meat. Old Murk-Eye also has 3 talents that I really like. Marathon of the Murlocs, most popular one, and generally the easiest one to use. Gives you more time to get Tide Hunters, usually 1 or 2 extra bodies at least, so it's really sweet. Then there's Tip of the Spear. Tip of the Spear gives you fast attacks, there's frontal deployment. Murlocs are also based on Murk-Eye's level when you use Tip of the Spear, which can be a benefit sometimes. But it's vulnerable to AoE because all the Murlocs will be in the same place. And I also do like Electric Eels. Electric Eels, that small stun, it can actually stun lock something like an Abomination, for example, so it can't do anything. But generally it's still the 3rd choice because the other ones are just stronger. And speaking of Abominations, Abomination actually also has 3 useful talents, although I find myself using Noxious Presence almost all the time because it's just so good. It just adds area damage to the mini and it's wonderful. Then there's Cannonball, and which is a long stun. It's a little bit difficult to get it to proc at the right time. It can be procced multiple times. If you have a healer with Abomination, you heal it above 50%, it goes back down to below 50%, it stuns again. So there are some fun things that you can do with Cannonball, but it's just no Noxious Presence. Finally, there's Fresh Meat, maybe a little bit lackluster compared to the other 2, but it does have some PvP uses, especially because there's lots of small minis in PvP, and then you can hook them and maybe one-shot them. Because in PvE you don't always find suitable targets, so that you would be able to really make good use of that one-shotting ability. Ancient of War is still played for 1 talent and 1 talent alone, and that talent is Lightning Rod. Game-changing for PvP, strong in some PvE encounters like Ragnaros in Molten Core, just redirecting unbounce, redirecting spells, that's a unique ability. And the Sapling, okay, that's a bunch of DPS, but why would you want that? Well, Ancient of War just isn't that strong. It's just, Lightning Rod is just so much better. And then there's Behemoth, which is pretty much useless, because if you want that effect, you typically just want to play something like a Molten Giant. For Angry Chickens, 1 talent is above all others, and that's Furious Fowl. It adds even more damage. Chickens are glass cannons, you can play around it, you can mitigate that, and you just want as much damage as possible. Sure, there's Walking Crate, your chickens can be protected a little bit. It's hilarious in Nashala where you get a copy, you get 2 crates and you get a lot of chickens, but it's still nowhere near as good as Furious Fowl. And finally there's Sacrifice, which can be used with other beasts, but generally it's just not that great. Arcane Blast has really found a new life after the Torrent talent buff, and Torrent is now my #1 recommendation. There are strong Torrent use cases in long co-op fights, there are even some use cases in PvP. Note that the maximum level state it can gain is +10, and now it gains a level after rank 3, which really helps you level it up, and it's just wonderful. Then there's Amplification, easy to use, can make a difference with something like Thalnos, for example. You can just get bigger and bigger Arcane Blast, so it's okay. And Arcane Power hits harder, so if you have like Jaina Arcane Power, people used to play that at one point, but Torrent generally has just overtaken the others. For Banshee, it's really hard to see myself playing anything other than Will of the Necropolis. It's always strong, you never know when you steal something that's already heavily damaged, and then it heals to full, and then it's at your service. Whereas Unholy Frenzy, you need to get something and then it needs to be able to attack something immediately because Bloodlust wears off. Or Solar Eruption, 180 elemental damage. That's just not enough. So, Will of the Necropolis, by far the best talent for Banshee. Bat Rider's main talent is Enchanted Vials, increased size of Flaming Pool, and yeah, having that big size, you have a fight somewhere, tank is holding everyone at place, and then more stuff gets burned, that's just good. Although Flaming Pitch does see occasional play in Molten Core sometimes, in Mythic sometimes, because If you send Pathrider alone against melee troops, then it slows them down and gets more time on them and they don't get to their target, so that can be sweet. Whereas Fire Saw plus just is pretty lackluster. For Blizzard, it's almost always Cold Snap, full damage, limited movement, like what is there not to like, it's just so beautiful. Ice Crown can sometimes help you defensively, and Brittle Ice, if you have physical damage troops nearby, then Brittle Ice can sometimes add a little bit more damage, but Cold Snap is just so far superior. Bog Beast has two good talents. First of all, there's Living Wood, which is kind of the default talent, so it has armor and resistant, and armor until 30% health. It doesn't get armored back if it goes below 30%, and gets healed back up, so it's not very good for healing comps. But when you're just using Bog Beast otherwise, then it's really strong. And Flourish is better than Living Wood if you play with a healing comp, typically, so then you can get a lot more healing into Bog Beast and increase its survivability. Whereas Rampant Growth just doesn't seem very useful. Chain Lightning talents are typically quite mediocre. Brilliant Flash is the strongest one because you get stun, and stun always forces a retarget, and there's some advantages just to be able to stun even for a brief moment. Then there's Reverberation, you get some flexibility, you can kill some bigger targets with Chain Lightning that can be useful. And then there's Storm's Reach, okay, it jumps a lot longer, but typically you just don't get many positions where you can make good use of that. With Cheat Death, I almost always use Vampirism. It just lets your troops heal back up, and that's very strong. Then there's Seal Fate. I mean, you could use that for final push, so you get the Bloodlust effect without using another effect, and that can be great, but it's very limited otherwise. And then there's Apocalypse, and requires a very specific build around, but you can do some fun things with it if you go through all that trouble. For Chimaera, my clear favorite is Corrosive Breath. It adds so much damage. It's the top PvE talent for sure. It's just very, very powerful. I sometimes see Leviathan used in PvP. Comes in second, it adds more survivability to the Chimaera, and that can be powerful. It caps at 3 stacks, so you can't get just infinite health on it, but you can get some. And then there's Frost Shock, and Frost is a good effect. But Frost Shock is still the weakest talent. The Poison Head is always the one that shoots first. So it takes time before you can even apply that first stack of frost on the enemy, and that really weakens the talent. Core Hounds are almost always played with the Eternal Bond talent, allows you to split push with the Core Hounds, they can resurrect each other wherever they are, it's just wonderful. I mean, the other talents just cannot compete. Guard Dog adds a bit of defensive damage, Fire Rebirth adds a little bit of damage, but yeah, Eternal Bond, you're just always going to use that. Dark Iron Miner has 3 nice talents, 2 pretty good ones overall and 1 a little bit more situational. Dwarven Ambition is nice, adds damage, adds also mining speed, so it's really sweet. Then there's Gold Mine, used especially in PvP, can deny mining from kobolds for example, because you mine the veins when you mine them. And then finally there's Dark Iron Armaments. It's generally the weakest of the 3, but it has some really sweet synergies, especially with Ragnaros, because then you get armored, and then you get the damage reflection, and Dark Iron Miner in a Ragnaros army actually often uses Dark Iron Armaments. Darkspear Troll is a mini that has 3 strong talents. The best overall is Big Bad Voodoo. It just adds crazy amounts of survivability to the troll. It just keeps healing up like crazy all the time. My second favorite is Serpent Sting, because poison is really powerful, poison stacking is very powerful, and with Serpent Sting, Troll can support other poison minis and they can just take down big opponents. There are some uses for headhunting as well. Headhunting has some weaknesses because Troll is just going to start blazing at lightning speed, and then that means that Troll is going to get ahead of your army and then it's just going to get itself killed. However, there are some places where you use it, like for example against Onyxia, you can use that to kill eggs and whelps, and then Troll is just going to shoot them down really, really quickly. So it's situationally useful, but often it results in Troll becoming a little bit suicidal. For Deep Red, the strongest talent is Melting Point. Damaging armored enemies removes their armor, so that can make surviving minis weaker against physical damage, or if you're facing a Ragnaros leader, then you can just take away the synergies. Attunement is also fine, allies caught in the effect gain resist, and 10 seconds of resist, that can sometimes be valuable. Whereas Double Dragon, which used to be the top talent for this mini, then it's just too expensive nowadays. Defias Bandits have 2 really strong talents and 1 a little bit weaker one. And I've been thinking about which talent should I pick first, and I think actually I would pick Pick Lock, because it adds great gold income, its unique effect, but of course it is situational. Sometimes you just don't have the right map and then it does nothing. It is the most popular PvP talent for the mini though. Then there's Deadly Poison, adds significantly more damage, and synergizes with our poison minis, so I do like that a lot. Whereas I don't like Last Resort as much. It can help you control a fight, but it's generally much weaker than the other two. Dire Battling is a mini that has 3 strong talents, and I really struggled to put them in order, but I think Midnight's Call would still be my first pick, because then Battlings can ambush small minis. Once they get the first kill, then they just fly in stealth to the next one because it stealths the entire pack, and then they just kill again and stealth and kill again and stealth, and that can be really, really strong. However, the top PvE talent I think is Soundbite. The Soundbite allows them to deal cleave damage, and cleave damage can be very powerful. They're hitting at the boss, and then they just also kill stuff that the boss happens to spawn, and that is powerful. And then there's Guano Happens. It has uses for breaking stealth, it has uses for preparing the board for some situations, and it's an overall pretty decent talent, but just not on the level of Midnight's Call and Soundbite. Drake has 3 viable talents. 2 of them offer unique abilities and 1 of them adds more damage, so the unique abilities tend to take precedence. So Mother Drake adds lots of eggs along your path. It's very, very useful. There are many maps where you want to have Drake just flying around with Mother Drake and getting those wellbacks all around the map for you. Then there's Roost, perched on top of a nearby tower, staying there to defend it. It has seen some play in some Onyxia strategies, for example, but it's very niche, but it's also unique, so you kind of want to have it available. Whereas Engulfing Flames, damaging enemies burns them, that's just more damage. And okay, more damage is good, but then you're skipping on something unique until you get your Drake to epic. Druid of the Claw has 2 pretty good talents, and third one is a little bit lackluster. Rejuvenation is the most popular talent for Druid of the Claw. I mean, it's kind of nice. It allows the druid form to heal, which is sweet, although it lacks smart targeting. So it's always going to heal the closest injured ally. It just doesn't heal the one who's injured the most, or your tank, or anything like that. But it's still a brand new ability, and without that your druid just cannot heal at all. And then there's Leader of the Pack, a strong damage increase when bear form, so that's pretty sweet. And finally there's Regrowth. I mean, it heals when you turn into bear form, but bear form has an innate heal already. It doesn't say so in the game, but you can see that it heals when you turn into bear form. So it's not that important to get a little bit more healing when you already have a bunch of healing. Dryad has 2 useful talents and then 1 that I wouldn't use. First of all, there's Nature's Swiftness, and that's a unique effect. Grant Rabbit movement speed to an ally ability has 1 charge. It does not stack with other speed talents, and it only adds plus 75% movement speed to siege minis. So it doesn't always make them rabid, but it's still a nice ability. It's something unique that you can't have anywhere else in the game. Then there's Barrage, favors new targets when possible, and you can root multiple enemies with this, for example, so it's a pretty sweet one sometimes. And finally there's Taunts, which I don't like, deal damage back to melee attackers, but Dryad cannot last long against melee attackers anyway. Earth Elemental has 2 useful talents and 1 lackluster one. So first of all, there's Obsidian Shard. On that, split into smaller elementals, and that's pretty sweet. It just gives it ability to tank longer. And then there's Ready to Rumble with the Taunt. And Taunt can be a very powerful ability, surprisingly powerful ability. So there are actually quite a few uses that I have used Ready to Rumble where nothing else really does the same. And then there's Shrapnel Blast, destroying a tower deals damage to nearby enemies, but that's just not very useful. I have changed my mind about Earth and Moon talents a little bit. I still think Moonfury is the best one, makes Starfall just such a huge damage spell. But then there's Balance and Nature's Grace. And Nature's Grace can give you that map-wide resist effect, which is kind of unique, except that there are quite a few ways to get resist anyway, and I just haven't found a use for this map-wide effect so far. Which means that Balance, even though Balance works like an Arcane Blast, so you have to cast Earth and Moon twice in a row. If you cast something else in between, you lose the Earth and Moon, so you have to cast both forms. But sometimes Earth and Moon is the only Cenarius spell in your deck, and then you just can use it with Balance so that you can get that Starfall out every time you cycle to Earth and Moon. And that is actually sometimes useful. It was used in some of the mythics, for example. Eclipse has 2 useful talents and 1 pretty bad one. So first the Solar Flare, and it's a big damage increase. Even if Eclipse is the only spell in your deck, then this is just going to do so much good for you. And then the Celestial Focus, and if you use Eclipse with other spells, this can be great. It works with both forms of Eclipse too. So then you do stuff like Jaina, Eclipse, Execute, and it's just wonderful. Whereas Umbral Force largely doesn't do anything. Execute is a mini that has 3 viable talents, although I would put them in this order. So Bloodthirst first, Bloodlust allies within spell area for 10 seconds. There are lots of situations where you want to use Execute both to deal damage and to make your other minis deal more damage. And then there's Killing Spree. If an enemy is killed, the next Horde mini costs 1 less. And this can include Execute itself. So in some cases you use Execute in a way where Execute is going to deal the killing blow, and then your next Execute is going to be cheaper, unless you have some other Horde minis in the deck. And finally there's Overpower, knock enemies away from the cast location, and this can have some uses, although it's a little bit weird sometimes. It can, for example, move the switches at making your Thermoplug, and it can also help you claim chests because the opponents are flung into air and then they're not contesting a chest, and that's just some weird stuff that Overpower can do. Sometimes you want the enemies to be clumped up, sometimes you want them to be separated. So depending on your goals, Overpower can also do something. Faerie Dragon is almost always picked for the Fae Blessing. Once per deploy, grant resist to a nearby ally. This is a permanent resist for that ally, so very, very powerful effect. Then Faerie Dragon also has invisibility, so it can gain stealth, and with stealth it can get closer to the enemies and it can actually win some fights. And then it has Phase Shift, which is kind of a sad talent, because it teleports backwards when attacked, but it doesn't retaliate. And Faerie Dragon has very low range, which means that then Faerie Dragon goes in, gets hit, so it teleports back, then it goes in, gets hit. If the cooldown is over, then it teleports back again, so it doesn't actually get to shoot back at all. So Phase Shift typically is only harmful for you. Fire Elemental is almost always used with Immolation Aura. It adds more damage, it adds 360 degrees of damage, and if you can get that on lifesteal in dungeons, then that's just going to be totally bonkers. Second most usable talent is Fan the Flames. Taking elemental damage increases damage dealt by 10%, stacks up to 30%, so a nice damage increase in situations where you're facing elemental damage. And finally there's Molten Core, but that's not very useful. It leaves this Molten Core on the ground, and that deals nice amount of damage, but the area is small, it only hits ground minis, and it dissipates after 2.5 seconds. So overall it's just not that impressive. Firehammer sort of has 3 viable talents, but if your Firehammer is only a rare and you need to choose 2, then the choice is pretty easy. Because first you want to pick up Heightened Rage. It can give you multiple levels if combat ends between, and if you can get multiple levels out of that, then it's just clearly the strongest talent. And then there's Multi-Metal, which is very situational, but it's strong when it's good. Deal 50% more damage to flying enemies. So against some flying bosses, against Onyxia's whelps, then this would be a very good talent. And finally there's Blazing Speed. Blazing Speed if there are non-flying enemies, and then Blazing Speed is the way to get the fastest damage increase, better than Heightened Rage in a way, but typically it loses to Heightened Rage overall, and then when you have 2 DPS talents you want to pick up the one that's typically more usable, which is the Heightened Rage. Flamewaker also has 3 talents that can all be useful, although I would first pick Backdraft. The range doesn't really affect the first attack, but then once Flamewaker starts hitting the enemies, preferably Flamewaker is behind a tank, then the hits just go further and further away, and it reaches very, very far away, so it can be stellar in the right situation. Of course, sometimes it just does nothing. Then there's Heatstroke, which is sometimes used in PvP, might have some niche applications in PvE content, because it slows down the opponents and then they don't reach the Flamewaker as easily. And finally there's Engulf, which is just a pure damage increase. For Footman, my number 1 choice is Shield Bash. It's just universally useful, getting those stuns, forcing the retargets, it's just very, very strong. Then there's also Fortification, gain 30% extra empty health. But the way Fortification works is that first it buffs the health by 30%, and then it deals 30% damage, actually leaving the Footman to only 92% of its original health. So if you don't have a healer and you have Fortification talent equipped, your Footmen are weaker than Footmen without the Fortification talent. So Fortification, yeah, great if you have healers around, but if you don't have healers, then that talent is actively bad for you. And finally there's Last Stand, but it just usually doesn't do enough to warrant using it. Crosswolf Shaman is typically picked for Earth Shield, which is great. Grant armor to a nearby ally. Ability has 1 charge, so you grant armor to Fire Elemental, or to Drakkisath, or to Abomination, and that's just really, really sweet. You used to see a lot of Frostwall Shamans with Earthwall Totem in PvP. Earthwall Totem is one of the fine ways, actually it is the only way to heal your base, so it can be very useful. However, it was nerfed in PvP so that it doesn't heal your main base, it doesn't heal your barracks anymore, which means that the main PvP use of it was just completely removed. And in PvE there are not as often situations where you need to heal your base. But if you do, then well, then you need Earthwall Totem. And finally there's Lightning Mastery, but Shaman's base damage is very low, which means that even if Shaman deals damage to multiple targets, it's still weak. Gargoyle has 3 talents that can all be useful. By far the most commonly picked is Wing Buffet, because Wing Buffet increases move speed by 33%. Generally the most useful one, because you want your Gargoyle to reach the target and then hit it. Note that Wing Buffet does not work with the speed buff from Dryad, which means that if you use Dryad with the Gargoyle, then you need to use some other talent. Well, then there's Obsidian Statue. On death, summon a statue with Taunt, lasts until destroyed. I have used this a lot against Baron Geddon actually, so that then the Gargoyle is going to keep Baron Geddon in place just a little while longer. Another talent which actually people have also been using as Baron Geddon is Aerial Superiority. Incoming damage from flying minis is reduced by 50%. So if you use Gargoyle on a map where there's a lot of flying enemies, then this can really help keep Gargoyle alive. Ghoul has one talent that's just so far ahead of the other two that you really just always want to use that, and that talent is Bone Shield. Cannibalizing grants armor for 10 seconds. So this helps Ghoul tank and survive so much more, so it's just wonderful. Then there is Taste for Blood, deal 50% additional damage to enemies who are below 50% health. Okay, pretty sweet damage increase I suppose, but typically you want your tanks to be soaking damage and not dealing damage, so it's not that great on a tank. And then Ravenous Cannibalizing grants Bloodlust for 10 seconds. But yeah, usually you just want Ghoul to survive when it's cannibalizing, so yeah, just not as good as Bone Shield. Nullbrute has 2 useful talents and one that's very niche. The first there's Rabid, reduce deploy cost by 1 gold and gain the cycle trait, which makes Nullbrute much more usable. Then there's Thick Hide, gain armor. So this is good against physical damage, and it has synergy with Ragnaros, because Ragnaros gives your minis that damage reflection if they're armored, so that can actually be pretty sweet with Ragnaros. Finally there's Pillage, deal siege damage. I guess there is some synergy with siege damage and Sneed, but typically Pillage just isn't doing anything. Goblin Sappers have one job: get to the tower and blow it up as quickly as possible, which means that Rocket Powered Turbo Boots. That's the talent that you're using almost 100% of the time with Goblin Sappers. It just makes them so much more effective. For example, if they're up against a rocket tower, then if they have turbo boots, the rocket tower rocket is too slow to hit them and they connect. Whereas if they don't have that, then the rocket tower can actually shoot the sappers. Then there is Extra Boom. If slow sappers are enough, then that adds even more damage. And finally there's Crude Gunpowder, but the burn on death just isn't very useful. It's mostly there if sappers fail to do what they wanted to do and you get a consolation prize, and that's just not good enough. Griffin Rider is a tricky one because all talents see a lot of play. I would typically pick Odin's Fury first. Odin's Fury is the best DPS talent for Griffin Rider, and it is the top PvE damage talent. Then there's Airdrop. Airdrop is niche, but it's super important for the strategies where it's used. It sees some play in PvP. In race strategies, focus on a level up a mini like Ragnaros, so you can get plus 10 levels on your Ragnaros by getting airdrops on the Ragnaros, and then Ragnaros is going to defend your base. And the whole strategy is built around that talent, so you absolutely have to have it for that. However, the most popular PvP talent is Mighty Throw. And Mighty Throw, I'm always a little conflicted about Mighty Throw. Gain plus 3 range. Undocumented, it also slows down the attack speed from 1.1 to 1.3, so almost a 20% DPS loss. So Mighty Throw is only useful in scenarios where you're getting like 1 versus 1 fights, and because you have that extended range, you get to shoot first, and then you get to kill the enemy before they actually get in the range to shoot back at you. But for any sort of sustained engagements, then Odin's Fury is just so far superior. It's silly really, because it's actually more than twice the DPS. Harpies have a clear top pick, and that's Infectious Swipes, gain poison. Super damage increase, phenomenal talent overall. Harpies are totally different unit when they have poison or if they don't. The second pick would be Trinket Collectors, gain the minor trait cost increased by 1. So if you don't mine with your Harpies, then that's really bad, but there are specific maps where you want to use Harpies for mining. None of them require Harpies for mining. You can always get by with something like a Dark Eye Miner or some other different way. There are no strategies currently that mandatory you have to have Trinket Collectors, but in some maps it is very useful, and for those you want to pick it up. And then there's Talon Dive, good against medium-sized targets. Generally, it's just so much worse than Poison. Poison is just incredibly strong with Harpies. Harvest Golem has 2 good talents and then one pretty weak talent. So first, this has Unstable Core, stun nearby enemies for 3 seconds on death, and because Harvest Golem resurrects and then dies again, so it dies twice, that means 2 sets of stuns, and that's really strong. Then there's Trojan Chickens. On death, spawn 5 Angry Chickens. And again, you spawn 5 Angry Chickens twice, which means that you're actually spawning a lot of Angry Chickens out of that Harvest Golem. So that's also a pretty strong talent. And finally, there's Bountiful Harvest. On death, apply heal over time effect to nearby allies, which just isn't very strong, so that would clearly be the third pick. Headless Horseman has 3 viable talents. There's Knighted Experience at 40% health, heal to 80%, and stun nearby enemies. Ability has 1 charge, so good generic talent, stun, more health, just what is there not to like, it's wonderful. Then there's Night Watch, and that one is unique. Remain at the deploy location attacking enemies who approach. So the Horseman, as long as it's being aggroed, you can actually pull Horseman quite far from its deploy location. But eventually, when combat ends, it will return, no matter how far it will return. So that's different than Grunts with Guard Duty, because Grunts with Guard Duty, once they're aggroed, they will actually go on attack and they won't return back to their position, but Horseman will always return, and that's totally unique ability and wonderful ability. But then again, there's also Decapitate, which is not bad. On kill, gain Bloodlust for 5 seconds, and that's more DPS, and if you have something like a Sylvanas deck with the Fury talent Sylvanas, then that Horseman can just get totally out of control. So all 3 are viable. For Whole Gnome, my typical first pick is Inner Fire, Armored and Resist for 5 seconds. And there are so many cases where I want to get a little bit of armor, a little bit of resist, and Whole Nova can help me out. Then there's Amplify Magic. Effects are doubled on all Elemental Minis. And that means Elemental Minis in your team get double healing, Elemental Minis in the enemy team take double damage. And that actually makes it the most common PvP talent, because there's some good healing and damage going on with that one. Then there's Renew, also adds heal over time to allies, so it actually doubles the healing. There's as much healing in the heal over time as in the immediate healing, and it's okay. But it's typically weaker than Inner Fire in PvE, so typically we would just pick Inner Fire first, Amplify Magic second, and Renew would be the third one. For Huntress, the first pick is very close. It's between Elven Might and Shadow Meld. So either 50% additional damage to initial target, or Stealth and Ambush. Typically, Elven Might is the top PvE talent. You usually need more sustained damage in PvE, so then getting that sustained damage is good. And Shadow Meld is top PvP talent, because usually you want burst damage in PvP. But you can use both talents in both environments. It's totally fine. But usually, if you are more PvE oriented, Elven Might, PvP, then Shadow Meld. And that leaves the final pick to be Darnasian Steel. The bounces are situationally actually quite strong. For example, in a Whelp duty against Onyxia, in Onyxia fight you would use Darnasian Steel typically if you have a very high level Huntress, but in most fights it's just lackluster compared to the other 2. Living Bomb has 2 damage increase talents and then 1 movement control talent, and typically the movement control for this one is not very important. So Chain Reaction, generally the strongest talent, then Blast Radius, reliable added damage, and finally the Burden of Fate as the third choice. For Meat Wagon, your first choice should always be Filet Trebuchet. Increase bombard range by +2, because this opens up completely new strategies. This is just a talent that you absolutely have to have on your Meat Wagon. The next one will be Grease Gears, gain Fury. It takes a while to stack up that Fury with the attack speed of Meat Wagon, but it is still a damage increase. And then there's Meat and Bones, which is actually a damage reduction, so there's really no reason to get that talent. Molten Giant's talent choices were completely changed by the rework to Bolster, Heal and gain 1 gold when destroying a tower. So Bolster now has gold gain, it has more healing than before, it's the new top talent for Molten Giant. And this previous top talent is now the second one, Threatening Presence. Arcane Taunt. Taunt is undervalued often. Taunt can be strong, especially on a mini as big as Molten Giant. And finally there's Blood of the Mountain. It deals 180 damage when it explodes, but generally that is not enough. So Bolster, Presence, then Blood. Moonkin is also now completely different after the rework, with Typhoon being the new top talent. It knocks back and it stuns briefly, it doesn't actually daze, and it can be reactivated by healing Moonkin back to above 50% health. So it's super annoying to deal with. If you have Moonkin and a Priestess and Moonkin takes damage and Typhoons and takes damage and Typhoons, then that is super annoying. Then there's Moonglow. Moonglow next spell played after Moonkin gains 2 levels. So it doesn't have to be the next mini that you play, just the next spell. So it's now much better than it used to be. It does not stack, but the effect stays there waiting for you until you cast a spell. And finally, Vengeance is the weakest one. Even though they tried to rework it a little, taking damage increases attack damage by 50% for 5 seconds, but it has an 8-second internal cooldown. So you have 5 seconds of increased damage, 3 seconds of regular damage, 5 seconds of increased damage, and so on. So Vengeance is just the weakest talent for Moonkin right now. Mountaineer was also reworked and some of the talents were reworked as well, but luckily the pick order remains the same. So we have Intimidation, the bear roars every 10 seconds, stunning up to 3 nearby enemies for 1 second, and that's wonderful. So that's still the first pick. Then Frenzied Spirit for some damage, and finally Mend Pets, only useful in some kind of beast decks. It's actually really hard to make Mountaineer heal other beasts, but I mean, if we got some big beasts, then I could see Mend Pets becoming more useful. Murloc Tidehunters have 3 strong talents, but the strongest of them is Safety Bubble. Deploy with a bubble that blocks the first attack, and anything that can completely negate an attack, that is strong. So Safety Bubble is the first pick. Then Morlocks for more DPS and Careful Aim for more range. For Necromancer, Jeweled Skulls is almost always the strongest talent because skeletal mages are so strong. They can shoot air, they frost, they are just a wonderful unit. So you really want those over skeletons in almost every scenario. So Jeweled Skulls is by far the best talent. Then there's Cult of the Damned. On kill, summon a skeleton. And sometimes there are maps where just creating that infinite chain of skeletons can be strong. And then Cult of the Damned can shine. And finally there's Breath of the Dying. On death, summon 5 skeletons. Okay, that's a little annoying to deal with, but nothing too special. For Ogre Mage, the first pick is very clear. It's Frost Firebolt, gain Frost. Because Frost is a strong ability, and Ogre Mage's Frost Firebolt actually applies Frost also to bosses for the full 2 seconds. All other Frost effects are only 0.5 seconds on bosses, so Frost Firebolt Ogre Mage is really a menace. Then Avarice, gain Blood Dust when blasting ally, and finally Ignite as the weakest one. After some buffs, Plague Farmer has a clear number 1 talent for pretty much all content, and that's Splashing Pumpkins. Increase range by +1 and double the splash area. And double splash area, that is absolutely huge. It deals so much damage to the backline at a further range. It's totally crazy. Splashing Pumpkins is so incredibly strong. There might be some niche scenarios where you could use Virulence, because on kill, poisons enemies need a target, so you can get some more poison out of that, but I mean, Splashing Pumpkin is just so good. Because of the splash range too, so you're dealing damage to so many more enemies with Splashing Pumpkins than you do with Virulence. And finally there's Parting Gift, which is a little lackluster. For Polymorph, it's mainly a choice between 2 talents. Golden Fleece typically is the best one, which makes Polymorph really cheap, because you get some gold back. And then there's Exploding Sheep. And if there's lots of squads, lots of things like some of the Arthas Mythic missions, for example, Exploding Sheep followed by some damage spell, and then all the sheep explode, and that's a lot of damage. So there's definitely some major use cases for sheep as well. But then there's Stable Transfiguration, lasts twice as long, but sheep regenerate health very quickly. Those sheep are unkillable practically, and that means that you use that when you want a distraction in order to kill something, but there just aren't any situations right now in the game where that is really strong. Priestess has 3 useful talents, although 2 of them are stronger than the third one. Powered Shield is by far the most general use out of these. Gives immunity. Immunity is super powerful, so Powered Shield is almost always the right option. However, there are some scenarios where Empowered Renew can be stronger. First of all, if you combine Priestess with Ragnaros, because Empowered Renew is one of the few things that can heal Ragnaros full heal. True Ragnaros is the healing reduction. So there, Empowered Renew Priestess with Ragnaros, that's a pair. And it's also good with some big tanks. It's stronger than Powered Shield if you're healing like a Molten Giant or an Abomination. but almost always Powered Shield is the best one. Finally, the Spirit of Redemption. It sees some PvP play behind Powered Shield, because if you lose your Priestess in PvP, then it still heals the minis around it. But it's by far the least useful talent in PvE, so it's just not that good. Also considering that you can use Powered Shield in PvP too. For Prowler, I typically prefer On the Prowl. Surprise attacks, Prowler doesn't get attacked while it's on its way, and that stun, it's just beautiful. Although there are some cases where Predatory Instinct is stronger, deal double damage to enemies who are at almost 75% health, but I just typically prefer the stealth. And finally, the Pack Leader grants nearby beast allies additional damage, which can be strong in some beast-specific decks. Pyromancer has 2 useful talents and 1 totally useless talent. So first there's Pyroblast, deal triple damage on the first attack. Even though it happens only once per Pyromancer, it's still very, very strong. It's just, you can see the damage difference. Then the second pick would be Conflagrate. Splash area is doubled, so it does increase the area, and that's useful in some cases, like for example against Onyxia, against the whelps there. That larger radius is good if your Pyromancer has enough levels, but straight up damage typically helps you more. And finally there's Blaze of Glory, which you should never pick because it's really, really bad. I mean, you pick it once it's epic for the level, but you just don't use it. Wilbur has 3 talents, all of which have some uses, although over time I just tend to use Bramble Burst more and more and more, especially after all the buffs it has gained. Inflict poison on nearby enemies when emerging. And it's just so strong. Immediate damage on the enemies before it has even burrowed up, extending poison duration on targets. It's just wonderful. Bristleback deals small amount of damage to melee attackers, can sometimes be useful, like if you're facing chickens for example, and you put Bristleback Quillbore out there, then all the chickens are just going to kill themselves. But other than that, it's not so great. And then there's Tunnel Vision, which allows Quillbore to unburrow faster, and it can open like chests faster like that, but other than that, Tunnel Vision just doesn't bring much. All 3 Raptor talents can contribute something, although usually are picking between 2, which are Strength in Numbers, because that's a lot of damage when you get a lot of Raptors out there, and Motivation, which also sees a bunch of play in PvP. Gain Bloodlust for 10 seconds when approaching a chest or gold vein. Previously, Motivation gave them Bloodlust where they were close to a chest or gold vein, and once they moved past it, then they lost the Bloodlust. But now they get to keep the Bloodlust and actually get to do a lot of stuff while Bloodlusted. Finally, there's Fast Food. It's healing. I mean, it is strong if your enemy is using lots of squads, lots of swarm minis, because then the entire pack gets healed every time something dies. But it's still the most niche out of the 3. Safe Pilot used to have 2 pretty equally strong talents, but the nerfs to coming in hot made it weaker, so now Gnomish Cloaking Device typically is always the best option. You get 2 hits in unless the opponent can deal with the stealth pilots, and that's the most damage that you can get. You get almost as much with coming in hot, but the crash damage is reduced, so not much of that damage is immediate, more of it comes over time, and you typically always lose your self-pilot immediately, so there was no chance for a hit from that or even 2 hits from that. Finally there's the Gnomish Mutanizer, but that typically is not very useful. For Skeleton Party, Ritual of Rime would always be my first pick. It's a completely unique thing. Summon 5 skeleton mages who guard the deploy location, and that's super strong. You put them on bridges, you put them in some strategic places. It's absolutely wonderful. Although sometimes you want your skeleton party to move, and if you're uncommon, you have only that 1 talent, then you need to disable the talent to use them. But that's totally fine, because skeleton party is one of the strongest minis without any talents. Then they have Corpse Run. They gain some levels as you keep deploying new skeleton parties, but it's not overall very strong, but it's a little bit of something. And then there's 5-man. 5-man is useful as an all-round talent. The skeleton party, 5-man skeleton party is stronger than the other 2 skeleton parties, but it also has Taunt on the tank skeleton, which can really backfire if you don't want to draw attention to that skeleton party. For skeletons, the top talent is very, very clear. It's Exhume. If deployed near a tower or meeting stone, deploy +2 additional skeletons. Your tower, neutral tower, enemy tower, any tower. It's just wonderful. Questing buddies, I mean, armor resist, but skeletons don't have that much health, so it doesn't do that much. And taunt, you usually don't want them to taunt anything. So Exhume is by far the best talent. The Ambush talent rework completely changed things for Smoke Bomb. Ambush allies deal 50% additional damage on their next hit, and that's a major damage increase. Combine that with ambush minis, combine that with Maiev, it's just phenomenal, so it's the one that you really want. Followed by Band of Thieves, grant +1 level to cycle minis within. It's a rare uncapped level increase tool, so there are some really sweet things that you can do with that one too. Which leaves Through the Shadows, affected minis move 50% faster until unstealthed. Even though it has its uses, then it just doesn't deliver quite what Ambush or Band of Thieves can do in their prime scenarios. The Spiderling's rework also completely changed what the best talents are, because by far the best talent is Bloated Carapace. Explode on death, poisoning and stunning nearby enemies, also hits flying minis, which means that you don't lose your Spiderlings for free anymore, and that's phenomenal. And Cave Dwellers, Stealth and Frost, and that's a sweet combination. These Spiderlings are really hard to stop. Which means that Envenom, even though it wasn't nerfed, it was previous top talent, deal twice as much poison damage, it's still okay. I mean, sometimes you really want all poison that you can get, but it just doesn't offer as much as Bloated Carapace and Cave Dwellers do. For Stonehoof Tauren, Momentum is the clear #1 talent. After connecting a charge, immediately charge a second time if possible. It just completely changes what Tauren is capable of. So you charge a tank, and then you immediately charge a ranged unit behind it, and that's beautiful. That's game-changing potentially. So the #1 talent by far. Pummel Stun is okay, but doesn't change things radically, and then Provoke, the taunt, just doesn't do too much. Swole Troll has 2 good talents and 1 lackluster one, and I would always pick Meteor Elbow first. Because if you want Swole Troll to fight against other minis and not just beeline towards the tower, then you have to have Meteor Elbow, otherwise you cannot use Swole Troll as a regular tank, so that's why it's the best talent. And then Troll Train, for the times when you want the Swole Troll to just beeline towards the tower, Troll Train gets it there the fastest, so it's the best talent for that. It's also a top PvP talent where you just want that Swole Troll to go and destroy some barracks. Which leaves Trollnado, which is largely useless. For Treants, Composting is the best talent. You can heal your Treant pack if they don't all die at the same time, and now that Treants get quite a bit of health if you play a large group of them at once, then that can really help them survive. Then there's Propagation, gives you 2 Treant packs, 1 at your base, but at base stats, so it's just not as strong, even though a bunch of Treants is nice. And finally there's Uproot, but it's ineffective. I mean, enemies are going to be in melee combat anyway, so Treants are going to be fighting against them, and it doesn't stack, so once the Treants die, then the effect wears off, and it just doesn't seem to do much at all. Vultures are pretty crazy after the rework. Now you get 3 Vultures initially and then 2 every time they kill something. And they have 3 talents that are all useful. And after rework I really like Migration. All additional Vultures spawn at your base. So you can just get so many Vultures. It's super hard to get rid of all these Vultures. Although sometimes you want them in one place, and then Feeding Frenzy, Flock gains Bloodlust for 5 seconds when spawning a new Vulture. Well, yeah, there's going to be so many of them, so that Bloodlust is so much damage. Finally, there's Tendon Rip, which slows the enemies down, which is useful sometimes, but just not nearly as often as the other 2. Again, the Warzone Grunts rework also completely changed which talents are the best, and now the #1 talent is Guard Duty. Sometimes you don't want it, but you can disable it if you don't want it. Remain at deploy location until entering combat, gain armored and reduce gold cost by 1. So use these with Onu, use these with Ragnaros, and they are absolutely phenomenal. Other than that, you have to figure out some way for the opponent to get them into combat so that you can activate them, but still it's a tremendously strong talent. Command, while deployed, Beast Allies deal 30% additional damage, and Command is nowadays map-wide, which means that you can have your Beasts in the front line, and then you just play your Grunts, and boom, the Beasts on the other side of the map gain the damage increase, and that is powerful. Which means that Blood Pact just falls behind. When a Grunt dies, the other gains Bloodlust and fully heals, but it's nowhere near as strong as Guard Duty or Command. Warzone Raider has 3 potentially useful talents. I like Thunder Armor the best. Damaging an armored enemy removes their armor. It's permanent against regular minis, it's 8 seconds against bosses, but it can allow for a lot more damage. Then there's Saboteur. Damaging a tower reduces damage dealt by 50% for 3 seconds. Makes this really strong against towers. And then the top PvP talent, Raising Focus. Become a siege unit, ignoring enemy minis, so just beelining towards towers, and the enemy has to worry about how to stop it. Not as strong typically in PvE, because You're facing a little bit stronger enemies. Just beelining towards them isn't that intimidating as it can be in PvP. But it's still potentially a strong talent, especially for PvP uses. For Whalebecks, Flame Burst is still the best talent. That damage just makes them a lot stronger. Game-changing talent, even though it has been nerfed some, so it doesn't deal as much damage anymore, but it's still phenomenal. Then there's Rookery. It's also fine. It's weaker nowadays. It used to summon an additional whelp. It doesn't do that anymore. But it's an okay talent, but it typically just loses to Flame Burst. And then Chromatic Plating, the Taunt on Eggs. There are some niche uses for this, some niche strategies that can benefit from this, but overall it's not very useful. Witch Doctor has 2 strong talents and 1 weaker one, and the strongest is Spirit Ward. On kill, grant a shield to nearby allies, absorbing the next hit against them. Those shields add so much survivability, they are just phenomenal, so that's almost always the top pick. But there are some cases where you want Amplify Curse. Enemies killed by the Curse explosion also explode. So sometimes, especially in some of those mythic missions that we had, sometimes there are just so big swarms coming, and then Amplify Curse can just boom, 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 kill them all, which cannot be done with much of anything else, but in most cases Spirit Ward is just stronger. And finally there's the Alchemist Potions, but they are not very good. And the last mini, Worgen, Premeditation, by far the best talent, increase ambush damage by 50%. It adds so much damage. Then there's Lone Wolf. On deploy, grant +1 gold if no allies are nearby. But this nearby means a range of 20. That's very, very, very far away, so it's super hard to make it work. And Frenzy is quite situational, so I don't really like that. But Premeditation, the best Worgen talent. So those were all the talents in the game. It's super important to pick a strong talent for your uncommon mini and to pick another good option for your rare mini, because well, otherwise you have to go a long way ahead of you to get to Epic to get all the talents. But I hope this guide will help you make good choices and make your minis that much stronger. Thank you for watching. Click like and subscribe if you enjoyed this, and a special thanks to all of my Patreon supporters, YouTube members and Twitch subscribers who make all of these videos possible.